I didn't wake up one morning planning to risk my marriage. Things like that happen quietly, in the spaces you don't pay attention to. One long week at work, one colleague who listened too closely, one moment where my heart moved before I could pull it back. I tell this story not because I'm proud of it, but because I still ask myself how far I would have gone if something or someone hadn't stopped me. And maybe, if you've ever felt unseen in your own home, you'll understand why I almost crossed a line I can't forget. Welcome to this story. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from. Your support means the world, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Evelyn, are you listening? Daniel's voice came quiet, tired, drifting through the kitchen like steam from the kettle. I was standing by the window, staring at the pale Surrey morning, pretending to be more awake than I was. Before I could answer him, my phone buzzed. If that tiny vibration hadn't cut through the room, perhaps none of this would have happened. Perhaps I would have stayed safely within the comfortable walls of my life with Daniel. But it did buzz, and I did look, and from that moment onward, nothing sat quite the same. Work email, I murmured, though I'd barely checked. I need to head off. I kissed Daniel's cheek out of habit more than intimacy, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside into the crisp air. The train into London was its usual mix of subdued commuters, takeaway coffees, and damp coats, a life I knew by heart, a life I wasn't sure I fully lived in anymore. And that's the question I didn't let myself ask back then. Is it possible to feel lonely even when someone you love is sitting right beside you? Mondays at Arcton Consultancy were usually brutal stale biscuits, overlong meetings, and the same handful of people airing the same handful of complaints. I took my seat, notes ready, mind elsewhere. Then he walked in. Jonathan Hale, strategy team, soft-spoken, observant in a way that made you feel like he was reading the spaces between your sentences. He wasn't new, but he might as well have been for how little attention I'd ever paid him. Until that morning. Morning, he said as he slid into the chair 2 seats away from mine, nodding politely. Just morning, nothing more. Why did it land so differently? Morning, I replied, forcing a small smile. I didn't know then what that simple exchange would unravel in me. The meeting started. Charts, targets, plans for the new quarter. I presented the team-wide feedback audit. I'd compiled my usual work, nothing extraordinary. I'd done versions of it for years. But when I finished, Jonathan leaned slightly towards me and said quietly, "Just for me. You see people too well, Evelyn. It's rare." A harmless comment, on the surface. So why did my chest tighten as if he'd touched something I hadn't realized was bruised? "Do I?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He held my gaze a second longer than necessary. "You do." I looked away before I lingered. That would have been the sensible thing. Quick glance, polite nod, move on. But something in me paused, held, listened. Why did it matter coming from him? Why, at that moment, on that Monday, did those words slide into the empty pockets of my heart in a way Daniel's hadn't in months? When the meeting wrapped up, I stepped out into the corridor, pretending to check my email, but really, I was trying to steady myself. The office hum carried on. Printers, footsteps, murmured discussions. Behind me, Jonathan exited the meeting room. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," I said, too quickly. He gave a half smile. "Your presentation was stronger than you think. It's data, Jonathan. Numbers. Nothing poetic. Numbers don't tell people how to feel," he said. "You do that part." Why did I swallow so hard at that? Why did the corridor suddenly feel warmer? "Thank you," I managed. "That's kind. Honest," he corrected softly. Something flickered in his expression, something steady, something curious. I should have walked away then, changed the subject, mentioned Daniel, done anything except stand there, letting silence stretch into something charged. But I didn't. And that, perhaps, was the second small shift in a day full of tiny tilts. By the time I boarded the train back to Surrey, my thoughts were a jumble I didn't recognize. I stared out of the window, watching the blurred fields rush past, replaying his words far more times than necessary. Daniel called just as the train approached my stop. "Eve, pick up some milk on the way back." "Sure," I said. "Everything all right?" "Yeah. Just thought you'd be home earlier." That subtle hint earlier wasn't meant to accuse me. Daniel wasn't like that. But I felt something twist anyway. "Long meeting," I said. Silence. Not tense, just tired. We'll talk when you get home, he added before hanging up. Talk. A word that suddenly felt heavier than it should. By 10:30, Daniel had gone to bed. I sat downstairs with the faint glow of the lamp behind me, trying to make sense of the day. Why did a comment from a colleague matter so much? Why did it echo in my chest hours after? Why did I feel seen? I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me like that, like I wasn't just Evelyn who handles the tricky clients, or Evelyn who forgets to buy toilet paper, or Evelyn who's fine, always fine. Jonathan didn't look at me like a duty or habit, and that alone was far too dangerous. I should have confronted it then. I should have told myself the truth. I should have walked away from whatever spark had begun to warm beneath the surface. Instead, I let it glow. Ever so slightly. Just after midnight, when the house was silent, and Daniel's breathing floated softly from the bedroom, my phone buzzed again. One message. And one name I didn't expect. Jonathan Hale, still awake. The message from Jonathan, still awake, sat on my screen long after I'd locked my phone. I told myself I wouldn't reply. I shouldn't reply. But the truth is, I hardly slept that night. I kept thinking back to the meeting, to the corridor, to the way his eyes lingered as if trying to understand something I hadn't said aloud. By the next morning, I was no closer to understanding why the message unsettled me the way it did. I deleted it without replying, as if erasing it might erase the feeling too. But feelings don't disappear simply because you decide they should. I learned that quickly. When I stepped into the office building in London that day, it felt as though the air had changed. Or perhaps I had. And isn't it strange how the smallest shift inside can suddenly make everything look sharper? I saw him at the lift, Jonathan, holding a paper cup of black coffee, the steam lifting in soft curls. He looked up when I approached, his expression calm, unreadable. Morning, Evelyn. Morning. I wanted to keep walking. I should have. But the lift doors opened, and we stepped in together. Just the two of us. A confined space with nowhere to hide from the tension that neither of us dared acknowledge. He didn't mention the message. Instead, he said, "Your audit yesterday, there was something honest about it. People don't notice that kind of honesty unless they have it themselves. Is that your way of saying you agree with it?" I tried to sound composed. "It's my way of saying I understand you noticed more than what was written." It felt like he'd reached straight into my chest. I stared at the floor numbers blinking past, wondering how the conversation had slipped from work to something else entirely. When the doors opened, I stepped out too quickly. But he followed. "Evelyn," he said quietly. "I hope I didn't overstep." "You didn't," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. That was the moment things shifted so subtly I almost convinced myself nothing had happened at all. It started with harmless things. Teams work chats, project updates, shared frustrations about schedules. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone softened. Conversations lengthened. One afternoon, as we queued at the cafe around the corner, he asked, "Do you always carry that journal?" I looked at the notebook in my hand. "Makes me feel organized." "And does it work?" "Some days." He smiled in a way that made me feel like he was listening between the lines. We took our coffees to one of the small tables by the window. London buses rolled past. People hurried by. But the quiet between us felt different, comfortable, contained, almost private. We talked about work at first. Then the conversation edged somewhere else. "I think people assume I'm complicated," he said, stirring his coffee. "Are you?" "Only in ways that matter." He paused, watching me. "What about you? What do people assume?" "That I'm steady," I said. "Reliable. Always fine." "And are you?" I hesitated. Why was that question so difficult? "No," I admitted softly. "Not always." It should have stopped there. A confession shared over coffee that could easily be forgotten. But instead, he leaned back slightly, his voice low. "Tell me something Daniel wouldn't notice about you." My heart tightened. It felt wrong to answer, and yet the truth slipped out before I could catch it. That I'm not as strong as I pretend to be. He didn't react with sympathy or surprise. He simply held the weight of the sentence without dropping it. "Everyone hides something," he said. "Even the strongest people." Why did it feel like he was talking about more than strength? Why did his understanding feel like something I had been waiting for? I didn't ask those questions aloud. I didn't dare. As days passed, I found myself looking for him without meaning to. Listening for his voice. Noticing when he wasn't in the office. And I hated how obvious it felt, at least to myself. There was a strange awareness between us in meetings. Not obvious, Not inappropriate, but present. Quietly present. My guilt crept in as a whisper at first. This is wrong. You're married. Stop. But the thrill, the quiet one, the one rooted in being understood, kept pushing back. The lie slipped out far easier than I expected. That Thursday, I really did stay late at work. A project deadline. A handful of unfinished reports. But that wasn't the full truth. I stayed because Jonathan was staying. Because the office felt different when we were the last ones there, the lights low, the building quieter, the air thinner. At 6:30, my phone rang. Daniel. Still at work? He asked. Yeah, I said, sliding my chair away from where Jonathan sat across the table. Big deadline. All right. Don't be too long. I promised I wouldn't. Then ended the call with a smile that didn't belong to me. The lie sat heavy on my tongue, but I didn't take it back. Why didn't I? Jonathan glanced up. Everything okay? Fine, I said, pretending not to notice how easily those 4 letters had become my shield. By 8, the office had thinned to silence. Jonathan stood and brought a file over to my desk. Here, he said. Thought this might help you finish faster. I reached to take it. His hand brushed mine. Light. Intentional. A small touch that carried far too much meaning. I froze. He didn't pull back immediately. Just long enough for the air to change shape. Evelyn. His voice lowered, and the space between us felt unbearably still. You know this isn't just work anymore. The file slipped from my fingers and landed softly on the desk. And right there under the dim office lights, with my husband waiting at home, and the truth balancing dangerously in the middle, I understood that the line I'd been pretending didn't exist had just been crossed. I should have stepped back. I should have picked up the file and pretended nothing had happened. But after Jonathan's touch and those quiet words, you know this isn't just work anymore, I could barely hear my own thoughts over the pounding in my chest. I went home that night telling myself I'd make a clean break the next morning. I'd set boundaries. I'd choose sense over impulse. I'd remember who I was married to and why. But the next morning came, and the next, and nothing inside me settled. And when the project crisis hit later that week, keeping the entire office longer than anyone wanted, I found myself sitting at my desk again at 7:30, with Jonathan across from me. Maybe that's the truth I didn't want to admit. Sometimes temptation doesn't arrive as a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just 2 people, tired, overworked, and alone in a place where no one is watching. The rain that night was relentless. It slapped the windows in waves, streaking the glass with cold, silvery lines. Outside, the street lights flickered over wet pavements. Inside, the office hummed with a few stubborn computers and the distant rumble of the heating. Most of the team had already rushed home, escaping into the storm. Only a handful of us remained, me, Jonathan, and a couple of analysts who were too absorbed in their spreadsheets to notice anything else. I rubbed my eyes and pushed back from my desk. You'd think the weather could give us a break, I muttered. Mostly to myself. Jonathan glanced up. Stormy nights make people honest. Something about it. I tried not to react, but my pulse quickened anyway. Honest about what? I asked. That depends, he said. What have you been avoiding saying? I looked away, pretending to focus on the reports in front of me. His question sat there between us, uncomfortably heavy, and yet something inside me wasn't ready to let it go. The rain continued battering the windows, steady and loud. Almost like a backdrop for something I didn't have a name for. It happened suddenly, a popping sound overhead, followed by a soft click. Then darkness. Total, immediate darkness, except for the faint glow from the emergency lights near the exits. Oh, brilliant, I breathed. Just what we need. Jonathan stood, his chair scraping back slightly. Probably a fuse. The storm might have knocked something out. The dim emergency lights cast long shadows across the office, and the space felt smaller, quieter, almost suspended. My eyes adjusted slowly as I reached for my phone to use as a torch. You all right? He asked. I'm fine, I said. Just a bit on edge. Understandable, he replied. It's strange seeing the office like this. Strange didn't begin to cover it. In the half-darkness, everything felt more intimate, like we were standing inside a moment neither of us could easily escape from. He stepped closer, not intrusive, just near enough that I could hear his breath over the rain on the windows. Come on, he said softly. Let's wait it out. We ended up sitting on the low bench near the corridor window, the only place where the faint streetlights outside filtered in. The silence between us held a kind of fragile tension. Jonathan leaned back against the wall, staring at the rain. Ever feel like life moves faster than you can keep up with? He asked. All the time. He nodded slowly. My engagement ended because of that. I turned towards him. I hadn't expected him to share something so personal. She said I was there physically but miles away mentally, he continued. She wasn't wrong. I hesitated. Were you in love with her? I thought so. Or maybe I just loved the idea of who I wanted to be with her. That line cut through me clean, sharp, honest. The question formed before I could stop it. Do you regret it ending? He exhaled. Some days. But mostly, I regret that neither of us said what we were really feeling. Until it was too late. His eyes lingered on me then, longer than I was ready for. Your turn, he said quietly. Tell me something you haven't said out loud. My hands trembled slightly. I curled them into fists to hide it. I'm scared of disappearing, I whispered. Not physically. Just fading into the background of my own marriage. He didn't look away. He didn't judge. He simply listened properly, listened as if my confession mattered. That happens, he said. Especially when you're the one keeping everything together. How would you know that? Because you look like someone who carries more than people realize. His words struck something deep, something vulnerable, and I hated how much I needed to hear them. The storm outside softened to a low drum. The emergency lights flickered slightly, then steadied. In that dim glow, Jonathan shifted closer, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not bold, just near enough that I could feel the warmth from him. Evelyn, he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. He reached out, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. My breath caught. Every nerve in my body tightened. He leaned in only inches now. It was the smallest movement, the softest pause, but it felt like the world held its breath with me. I froze. And for a second, one terrifying, dizzying second, I almost let it happen. But then I pulled back sharply. Standing so fast I nearly slipped on the smooth floor. Jonathan, my voice wavered. I can't. He ran a hand through his hair, looking away. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, I whispered, heart racing. I'm married. I love Daniel. I don't know what's happening to me. It's all right, he said softly. I understand. But the understanding in his voice didn't make it easier. It made it worse. Because it wasn't pity. It was wanting. The power flickered back on a moment later, lighting the room as if nothing had happened. But something had. Inside me, guilt and desire crashed into each other, leaving me breathless. How could a moment so small feel so monumental? How could I let myself stand so close to a line I never imagined approaching? We finished our work in silence. I packed my things quickly, barely able to look at him. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't say anything else, but his eyes followed me in a way that made every step feel heavier. By the time I reached Surrey, the rain had softened into a thin mist. I walked home, wiping the damp from my cheeks, unsure if it was rain or something else. I didn't sleep the night Jonathan sent that message, the one that lingered in the air long after I'd walked into my house, drenched, breathless, shaken. Daniel's shadow in the dark hallway had already unsettled me, but it was the weight of everything unspoken that pressed on my ribs as I lay awake. By morning, I felt as if I were walking through fog, the kind that sits low over London rooftops, soft but suffocating. Daniel was already dressed, sitting at the dining table with a mug of tea cooling beside him. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't need to. The tension had already filled the room. Rough night? He asked quietly. It wasn't accusation. That almost made it worse. I nodded, pretending to fuss with the kettle. The storm kept me up. He didn't respond. The silence stretched until it felt like something I could lean against. Finally, he said, Evelyn. Something's changed. My stomach tightened. I'd known this conversation was coming, but I didn't know it would land so gently. No raised voice, no sighs of disappointment, just a steady observation from the man I married. What do you mean? I asked, though I already knew. You're distant. Even when you're home, you're somewhere else. His voice cracked slightly, and that was the part that made me flinch. I forced a laugh. It's just work. The project's taking a toll. His eyes studied me with a sadness I couldn't handle. Is that all? I said yes. I insisted. Over and over in my head. I rehearsed a conviction I didn't fully feel. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't. But why did it sound like a defense instead of the truth? He reached across the table, his hand hovering before he touched mine. Warm, familiar. The kind of gesture that had once been enough to soothe me. But now it only reminded me of how wrong everything felt. "Talk to me, Evie," he said. "Before this gap becomes something we can't cross." Was I imagining the urgency? Or did he sense what I hadn't dared admit to myself? I promised him I was fine. I promised him work would settle soon. I promised him we were okay. Promises have always sounded convincing when spoken early in the morning, when emotions are still soft and half awake. But as I left the house and stepped into the cool London air, those words felt thin. On the tube ride into Waterloo, I replayed the moment in Jonathan's office, the near kiss I could still feel if I allowed myself to remember the closeness, the warmth, the breath that almost bridged the space between us. I shut the memory out. I had to. Did other people ever face a moment like that one that felt both impossible and inevitable? I told myself to keep a professional distance the moment I walked into work. No lingering glances. No conversations that dipped below the surface. No reasons for my pulse to misbehave. It lasted until lunchtime. I spotted Jonathan outside a Pret near Waterloo, leaning against the railing with his hands in his pockets. Londoners passed him without a glance, too absorbed in their own rush to notice the way he straightened when he saw me. I tried to walk past. I truly did. But he stepped into my path, not touching me, not blocking me, just standing close enough that I felt the warmth of him. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I can't do this." The words tumbled out sharper than intended. "Do what?" His calmness made everything inside me twist. "Talking? Caring? Don't pretend you don't feel it." That single moment, those few words felt like the hinge everything rested on. "Jonathan." I exhaled, stepping back. "We shouldn't be doing this." "Doing what?" His voice was low, almost conversational. "Having lunch? Standing outside a Pret? This isn't a crime." I swallowed. "You know what I mean." He held my gaze, eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my skin warm. "I know you're scared. But you're scared of the wrong thing." My pulse stuttered. "Don't," I whispered, "please." He tilted his head slightly. "If you walk away now, at least be honest with yourself about why." I turned before he could say anything more. I could feel him watching me every step I took, every hurried breath. It unnerved me how much that gaze affected me, how much it echoed in my chest long after I'd disappeared into the crowd. Back at the office, I threw myself into work, pretending the earlier encounter hadn't happened. Pretending the tightness in my throat meant nothing. Pretending my life wasn't shifting beneath my feet. But late that night, as I sat in bed with Daniel asleep next to me, my phone buzzed. A new email. From Jonathan. My hands trembled before I even opened it. The message was short. "I think you're running from the wrong thing." I stared at it. Breath lodged somewhere between fear and something else I refused to name. What did he think I was running from? Before you continue listening, if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to show me your support by subscribing. Your subscription means a lot. It helps keep these stories alive. And without you, there's no way I can continue sharing the twists, the turns, and the raw moments that speak to the heart. Please don't leave me hanging. Subscribe now, thank you. The moment I read Jonathan's email, "I think you're running from the wrong thing," something inside me wouldn't settle. I tried to sleep, but the words clung to the walls of my mind, like dampness on old brick. By morning, nothing felt steady. Not my thoughts. Not my heartbeat. Not the space between what I wanted and what I feared wanting. I packed for the Manchester conference in a fog, telling myself it was only 2 days. Only work. Only a train ride, and a tight schedule, and 100 people who didn't care about my private chaos. But as I zipped my suitcase, I felt the truth pressing in. The distance I hoped would protect me wasn't distance at all. It was simply geography. And he would be there too. The train from Euston was crowded, noisy, filled with conversations too loud for the early hour. I took a seat by the window, hoping for solitude. But when Jonathan stepped on board and spotted me, his expression shifted, something like quiet recognition. Maybe something more. He sat opposite me with a polite nod, as if he didn't know the effect he had on me, as if the email hadn't rattled me to the bone. For the first 20 minutes, we pretended to focus on our laptops, but the hum of the train, the soft sway, the rhythm of rainfall tapping on the windows, it all made the silence feel far too intimate. Eventually he spoke. "Long night." A simple question. A dangerous one. I forced a small smile. "You could say that." He studied me, not with pity but with a strange patience. "You read it, then?" I didn't need to ask what it was. I did. I said quietly. And, there's nothing to say. He leaned back in his seat, gaze steady, as though he expected that answer. If that's what helps you breathe. I looked out the window because looking at him felt too revealing. He wasn't testing me. He wasn't pushing me. Somehow, that made everything more complicated. The conference itself was a blur of presentations, networking, forced smiles, and the constant sense that something inside me was shifting in ways I couldn't name. By evening, after hours of fluorescent lights and polite applause, the organizers hosted drinks in the hotel bar. I told myself I would go for 20 minutes. Just long enough to be polite. Just long enough to be seen. But then I saw Jonathan at the far end of the bar, glass of wine in hand. Jacket off. Shirt sleeves rolled just enough to make him look impossibly relaxed. The lighting was warm, low, the kind that softened everything and made even the quietest moments feel important. He noticed me immediately. I should have turned around. I should have headed straight to my room. Instead, I walked toward him. The bartender handed me a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, and I sat beside Jonathan, keeping what I hoped was a respectable distance. But it didn't feel respectable. It felt charged, and every time our elbows almost touched, my breath stumbled. He spoke gently. Long day. Very. You did well up there, you know. Your presentation had people actually listening. His praise hit deeper than it should have, because I realized how rarely I heard words like that anymore. We talked about the conference, London, the ridiculous price of train fares, whether the hotel pillows were designed to break one's neck. It should have been harmless, ordinary, but beneath every sentence lay something unsaid, something both of us felt but neither dared address directly. At one point, I asked, half joking, "Do you always analyze people this much?" He smiled. "Only you." And just like that, my pulse betrayed me again. The bar thinned out gradually until we were among the last still sitting there. I became aware of how close his knee was to mine, how warm the air felt, how his gaze lingered a fraction longer each time I looked away. Was I imagining it? Or was he giving me every chance to walk away? When we finally stood to leave, the air between us felt tighter somehow. The lift lobby was quiet, carpeted, the kind of hush that magnifies every breath. The corridor lights were soft, making everything look faintly surreal. As we walked toward the lifts, he reached out to gently brush a loose strand of hair from my face. A simple gesture, yet unbearably intimate. My breath caught. His hand lingered for a heartbeat too long. "Tell me to stop, Evelyn," he whispered. I should have said it. I should have stepped back. I should have remembered Daniel, our home, the life I promised to keep steady. But I didn't say a word. For one terrifying second, I leaned in almost without thinking, almost without breathing. His forehead touched mine. Barely. Just enough for the world to shrink into that single point of contact. I felt the pull, the relief, the danger. And then, a hotel guest walked past. The sound of footsteps, the slight cough, the harmless presence of someone merely heading to their room. But it snapped the moment in half. I stepped back so fast, it made my head spin. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move toward me. He didn't push. He simply murmured, "Good night, Evelyn," and turned away, leaving me standing there half suspended between guilt and longing. I forced myself to walk to my room, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, I shut the door, locked it, double-checked it, and then leaned against the wood as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. The room was quiet, too quiet. I walked to the mirror. My reflection looked back at me flushed, frightened, utterly changed. "I almost did it," I whispered. "I almost ruined everything." And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I was relieved or devastated. Morning arrived with a heaviness that clung to me from the moment I opened my eyes. I'd barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake with the same image, me in that hotel corridor, leaning towards Jonathan, the space between us measured in heartbeats. By the time the train back to London rolled through the outskirts, my decision was sealed. No hesitations left. No excuses. I couldn't let that moment define me. I couldn't let it grow roots. When I reached the office on Monday, he was already there. Jonathan stood by the window near the lifts, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense, but face calm, too calm. It struck me then how differently we carried the same weight. He wore it lightly. I was drowning under mine. He saw me approach, and something softened in his eyes. "Evelyn." I stopped a safe distance away. Though safe felt like a lie. Nothing about this had been safe for weeks. "I need to say something," I began. my voice lower than I expected. And I need you to hear all of it. He nodded, giving me space I hadn't even asked for. I shouldn't have let things get this far, I said. I should have stepped back sooner. I shouldn't have. I paused, unable to finish the sentence. I'm ending this, all of it, whatever we thought this was. It can't continue. He studied me. Quiet. Steady. Almost too understanding. I knew this was coming. It's the right thing, I said, though my chest felt tight. I never wanted to make your life harder, he replied. He exhaled slowly. I hope he knows what he has. The words caught me off guard. Not accusatory. Not bitter. Just painfully sincere. Jonathan. He shook his head gently. You don't have to justify anything. You're choosing your life. That matters. Just take care of yourself. Yeah? For a moment, I almost reached out, reflex more than desire, but I stopped myself. He noticed, and he let me walk away without another word. I expected relief as I left the building that afternoon, but all I felt was a tremor inside me. A slow, quiet ache that wasn't desire but something more complicated, something like grief for a version of myself I never should have become. The train ride home felt longer than usual. Surrey's familiar calm greeted me with its tree-lined streets and tidy rows of brick houses. But the moment I stepped through the front door, the atmosphere shifted. Daniel was in the kitchen, still in his work clothes, leaning against the counter as though he'd been waiting. His eyes lifted to mine, and just like that, the weight I'd been carrying doubled. You're back early, he said. His tone wasn't cold, just careful. I took a breath, steadying myself. We need to talk. The phrase hung between us, and in that instant, I knew he'd sensed this moment coming long before I admitted it myself. We moved to the sitting room. It felt too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that forces you to confront everything you've been avoiding. He sat opposite me on the sofa, elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced. All right, he said softly. Talk to me. I stared at my hands, trying to gather the courage to speak. Things haven't felt right, I said. Between us. For a long time. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I've been distant, I continued. Pulled away. I told myself I was just tired or stressed. But that wasn't the truth. He swallowed, eyes never leaving mine. Then what is the truth? I felt my throat tighten. I looked for someone else to fill the spaces you used to. His shoulders dropped, as though the words physically hit him. He blinked. Once. Then again, trying to process what I'd just confessed. Are you telling me you? No, I said quickly. No affair. Nothing like that. But I let myself get close to someone. Too close. I let my attention go somewhere it shouldn't have. I thought it was harmless at first, but it wasn't. It became something that made me question myself. And I hate that I let it reach that point. He leaned back slowly, exhaling in a way that felt like a wound being pressed. Evelyn, why didn't you talk to me? Why let it get this far? I shook my head. Because I didn't want to admit that we'd slipped so far apart. I didn't want to admit that I felt invisible. And I didn't want to hurt you by telling you I felt alone in a home we built together. The look on his face, raw, painfully vulnerable, nearly brought me to tears. I never meant to make you feel that way, he said quietly. I knew we were drifting, but I thought it was work, stress, life. I didn't know it cut that deep. Tears threatened, blurring the edges of the room. I'm sorry, Daniel, truly. I never wanted to be someone who sought comfort elsewhere. I don't even recognize the person I became these past weeks. He rubbed his hands over his face, then let them fall to his lap. Thank you for telling me the truth, he murmured. Even if it hurts like hell. I sat there, trembling slightly, the confession still echoing inside me. For the first time in a long while, nothing stood between us, not silence, not resentment, not unspoken questions. Just the bare truth, raw and exposed. Daniel looked at me carefully, almost cautiously. So, what happens to us now, Evelyn? The world felt unbearably still, waiting for an answer I didn't yet have. I didn't answer Daniel straight away. His question, so what happens to us now, Evelyn? Echoed through the house long after he asked it, settling into every room like a quiet reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. That night, neither of us slept properly. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rise and fall of his breathing beside me. There was no anger in the space between us, no shouting, no slammed doors, just two people uncertain of how to rebuild something they'd let crumble. By morning, the decision felt clearer. If we were going to repair what we'd broken, We needed help. That's how we ended up sitting side by side in a counseling room near Holborn, hands folded in our laps, avoiding each other's eyes while a softly spoken therapist named Helen asked us questions neither of us had prepared for. The room was warm, lined with bookshelves and quiet earthy colors. A small round table sat between us, holding a jug of water and tissues neither of us wanted to reach for. It felt strangely comforting. Though neutral ground, where the truth could exist without either of us retreating. Helen's voice was calm. Let's start with what brought you here. My throat tightened. We lost something. And we didn't say it aloud until now. Daniel nodded slowly. We stopped listening. Or maybe we listened only half-heartedly. Helen turned to me. And you, Evelyn? What do you feel you've lost? I hesitated, the words gathering slowly. Myself, I think. Somewhere along the way. Counseling forced us into conversations we'd avoided for years. Not dramatic arguments, just slow unravelings of things we'd both buried. My fear of being overlooked. His assumption that silence meant stability. The way we slipped into routines that looked fine from the outside but left shadows where affection used to be. One session blurred into the next, each one peeling back layers I didn't realize I'd carried so tightly. And then it happened quietly, on a Thursday evening after work. I came home, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened my phone. Jonathan's number sat at the top of my recent messages. I stared at it for a long moment. Not with longing, something softer, something honest. A recognition of the person I'd become when I let myself drift too far. Before deleting anything, I opened the last message he'd sent. One I hadn't seen. I hope you find what you're looking for. No questions. No pressure. Just a sentence that landed with a strange mixture of warmth and closure. I read it once, then again. And then I pressed delete, not just the message, but the whole thread, the saved number, every email chain, every trace of something that had almost rewritten my life. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. Instead, I sat back and breathed, as if I'd just let go of a version of myself that no longer fit. That night, during counseling homework, Helen asked us to sit together and talk about one thing we missed. Just one. Daniel looked at me, hesitating. I miss the way you used to hold my hand in bed. Before either of us fell asleep. The simplicity of it tugged at something deep inside me. I miss feeling like you could see me even on the days I couldn't see myself. He reached for my hand then, cautiously, as though he wasn't sure I'd accept it. I did. We sat like that for a long time, just holding hands. No grand declarations, no dramatic breakthroughs. Just a slow relearning of closeness. The gentle kind that doesn't announce itself but still means everything. The next weeks brought small changes. We actually talked over breakfast instead of rushing past each other. We cooked dinner together again, awkwardly at first, then more naturally. We spent evenings walking around our neighborhood, silent sometimes, thoughtful other times. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't meant to be, but it was honest. And that was new. One evening, as we walked by the river near Kingston, Daniel said quietly, I've been trying not to ask, but, do you regret telling me? I shook my head. No. It hurt. But it was the first real step back to us. He exhaled, shoulders loosening. I'm glad you said it before it became something you couldn't take back. I stopped walking then, turning to him. I didn't have an affair, Daniel. I know, he said gently. But you felt something. And that scared me. It scared me too. We started walking again. The night air cool on our faces. And as we crossed the bridge, I realized something quietly profound. The struggle hadn't only been about Jonathan. It hadn't even mainly been about him. It had been about me. My need for validation. My fear of vulnerability. The attention that filled cracks I didn't want to admit existed. The truth was simple and unavoidable. The affair I almost had wasn't with Jonathan. It was with the version of myself I wanted to be seen, heard, desired, unbreakable. But she wasn't real. Not the way I imagined. And rebuilding myself meant letting her go too. Back home, I sat with my journal, something Helen suggested, and wrote the words I hadn't managed to say aloud. Sometimes saving a marriage starts with saving yourself. Daniel came into the room a few minutes later, sitting beside me on the bed. You all right? I think so, I said softly. Or I'm getting there. He nodded. We will. Together. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I believed him. Our marriage wasn't magically fixed. The distance didn't vanish overnight. But step by step, we were choosing each other again. Honestly. Openly. Carefully. As I turned off the light that night and settled beside him, I felt something quietly hopeful, an understanding of who I didn't want to become, and who I still had the chance to be. I didn't have an affair, but I came close enough to realize who I didn't want to become. And sometimes, saving a marriage starts with saving yourself. It's strange how a year can pass quietly, almost unnoticed, and yet leave behind a version of you that feels unrecognizable from the woman you once were. I sometimes catch myself standing at the kitchen window, tea cooling in my hands, wondering how close I came to losing everything that mattered, not because of Jonathan, but because of the ache in me I refused to name. You might expect the months that followed counseling to have been lined with sudden breakthroughs and grand gestures. They weren't. They were quieter than that, broken conversations in the hallway, late-night cups of chamomile neither of us finished, Daniel sitting beside me on the sofa without quite touching me, as if waiting for permission. But we kept showing up. Maybe that was the miracle. And now, a year later, I find myself walking along the Thames after work, the air warm enough to smell faint traces of bread from a bakery near Blackfriars. I take this walk most Thursdays. A small ritual, a reminder of who I'm trying to become. Daniel meets me halfway today. He always pretends it's coincidence. "You're early," he says, slipping his hand into mine. It still surprises me, the way he reaches for me first now. "So are you," I reply, nudging him lightly. We walk without speaking for a moment, listening to the distant rumble of buses, the laughter of tourists, the river pushing steadily past us. There was a time when silence between us felt like a warning. Now it feels like space we've earned. At home later, I find an old box of my journals shoved behind winter coats we never quite pack away properly. Pages filled with scribbles, questions, confessions, fragments of emotions I struggled to name at the time. I skim through them and pause at one line I wrote the night everything came crashing into clarity. I don't know who I am right now, but I know I don't want to be the woman waiting for someone else to tell her she matters. I close the book gently, as if touching the past version of myself with care. There's a quiet knock on the bedroom door. Daniel peeks in. "You coming down? Dinner's nearly ready." "Be there in a minute," I tell him. His eyes flick to the box, and for a moment, I wonder if he'll ask. He doesn't. Maybe trust looks like that, knowing when to step closer, and when to let the other person breathe. I slip the journals back into the box, but this time I don't hide them. They stay on a shelf I can reach. Later that night, when the house has settled into its usual hush, I lie beside Daniel and stare at the faint glow from the street lamp outside. I think about Jonathan, about the message I never responded to, about the version of myself that reached for something outside my marriage, because she didn't know how to reach inward. I used to think affairs began with stolen glances or charged conversations. Now I know they start much earlier, in the silent moments, when you stop recognizing your own reflection. Daniel touches my hand under the blanket. A small gesture, but one that still feels like a question. I lace my fingers through his and answer it. We're different now. Not perfect, but real in a way we didn't know how to be before everything broke open. Some nights, as I drift to sleep, I think back to the woman I almost became. The one who might have stepped over that invisible line with Jonathan. The one who wanted to disappear into someone else's admiration because facing her own emptiness felt unbearable. I don't resent her anymore. I understand her. She was trying to escape. I'm learning to stay. And staying, truly staying, has been the harder road. But it's the one that led me back to myself. As I close my eyes, I whisper the truth I couldn't have spoken a year ago. I didn't have an affair, but I came close enough to learn the cost of losing myself, and the worth of fighting to come home again. And somehow, that feels like the real ending. Or perhaps the beginning I never knew I needed. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss out on the next story. Please subscribe now to keep following more stories, and turn on the notification bell to get exclusive updates straight to your inbox. Your support helps me keep creating these stories that speak to the heart.